Professor Mahmood Mamdani, thank you very much for breaking views with Unicef.
Thank you for inviting me.
Could we start perhaps with looking at Africa? How do you explain that image of political violence, the image of wars and famines in Africa, and how has that changed?
Countries which come out of colonial experiences have a greater tendency to go through civil wars because there are lots of unsettled questions. Who belongs? Who doesn't belong? Who collaborated? Who didn't collaborate? What are the boundaries, the definition of the nation? Who is in? Who is out? Africa is no exception. I mean, the US went through an amazing civil war. The Indians went through a civil war which ended up in partition. The Chinese went through a civil war which ended up in revolution. In the countries of Europe and North America, civil war is not on the agenda, but what is on the agenda is conquest overseas, wars between states. In our part of the world, it's wars within states.
You wrote about regionalization of these conflicts. Because of the huge porous borders, does that challenge the concept of a nation state?
I don't think the problem is porous borders. I think conflicts are spilling over because of our inability to address them. The situation is different in countries where the response to conflict has been a political process. So, for example, if you contrast Mozambique with Uganda, because Renamo in Mozambique was a movement not very dissimilar from the LRA in Uganda. Whether you take the incidents and the stories about the kind of terror, the kidnapping of civilian populations, including children, etc., the use of terror as either a strategy for mobilization or a strategy for spreading fear in the population, it was all very similar. What was different was the antidote. In the case of Mozambique, it was political reform. And today, Renamo sits in parliament as a major opposition group with prospects of maybe even being the government.
How do you reconcile a rebel group in Africa, in the Great Lakes region, Lord's Resistance Army, M23, any of those? Many of these rebel groups have used children. As you say, they torment a child population. The child population then becomes the abusers, much like an abused child can become an abusive adult. How do you square that up with the need for political change?
Well, first of all, I think we have to recognize that just about every group uses child soldiers. Not only the groups which are being indicted, but the ones which are not being indicted. I guess the only sure way is to address the causes of the conflict themselves. I can't think of an effective way of just having wars where children will be immune from the effects of the war, either as victims. Well, as victims either targeted or recruited into the war. I think the choice we face is whether a criminal process or a political process. And I don't think a criminal process has worked out anywhere, because the criminal process, you cannot settle a political problem in the courts, because in the courts you're either innocent or you're guilty. In the courts, the winner takes all. In a civil war, which is what most of the conflicts in Africa are, they're not interstate conflicts. In a civil war, nobody's wholly guilty and nobody's wholly innocent.
Do you see the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission as a blueprint for other conflicts, to resolve those conflicts, to take them forward?
I mean, the real lesson of South Africa is first of all that the NP had to decriminalize the ANC, the Communist Party, etc. The ANC, the Communist Party, had to agree that they would talk to the NP and they would talk to Broederbond. So they accept that instead of treating one another as enemies, you treat one another as adversaries. The difference is that you eliminate enemies. With adversaries, you can talk. Right? That's the real lesson.
You've written about how political violence has marked the 20th century, revolutions, counter-revolutions, wars and genocides, and particularly for post-colonial Africa. Is there some hope that the 21st century might be different for Africa's children?
Frankly, I don't see much hope in the way things are going right now. In some places, lessons have been learned. I mean, Zimbabwe is a very interesting example because the international community, the Western powers in particular, wanted the Southern African region, SADC, to, implement sanctions, to cut off electricity supply. And SADC said no, led by South Africa.
By the year 2050, we're going to see 1 in 3 children born in the world are going to be born in Africa. What does that mean for the continent? What does it mean for leadership?
I think there are two different issues here. One is the question of economic development. The second is the question of social development. African leaders, I think, are taking fairly seriously the question of economic development. The international context has changed. The monopoly of the West is eroding very rapidly. China is competing very effectively against this Western domination. The Chinese, the Indians to some extent, but the Chinese really are building the infrastructure of Africa in return for raw materials that they desperately want. And African leaders have learned some lessons from the Cold War, which is not to choose sides, but to be open to both sides, to play them off as much as possible, to keep your options open. And I think the figures speak for themselves. When it comes to social development, the story is, I think, not as bright, not as good, because I think social development is mainly the result of social pressures from the population, from an organized population. And I think there we still have some, distance to cover. I think the governments in Africa have learned the language of democracy. They have learned to utilize the institutions by which democratic progress is measured, like multi-party system or elections, etc., but to subvert them as much as possible. Whether it's in Zimbabwe or in Uganda or in Sudan or wherever, different places. So I think social development would follow social mobilization.
Professor Mahmood Mamdani, thank you very much for breaking views with UNICEF.
Thank you.
Know more about your world.
ENCA.com